When you finished writing On Chesil Beach, you must have left those characters behind and then moved on. So what was it like revisiting Florence and Edward nearly a decade later?
Technically, it was quite interesting because there's no dialogue between Edward and Florence until virtually they're on the beach, that central scene, that row. So coming back to it meant inventing a language for them, a kind of ways of speaking, ways of listening that were completely outside the realm of the novel. The novel is all set entirely in their heads, a privileged access that only novels can give you, which cinema cannot. So that was the first problem really to address. So given the central role of music in this, I thought Edward explaining a 12-bar blues to Florence as they come along the beach in the credit sequence would be the first indication of the gulf of misunderstanding that would fall between them. He's talking about the key of E, she's talking about the tonic, he's talking about a seventh, she suggests a minor seventh. She's talking about the subdominant, he's talking about the key of A. And then, of course, she's talking about Chuck Berry being bouncy and merry, which, he thinks is inappropriate and amusing. And meanwhile, Edward at rehearsals for Florence's string quartet, he's half asleep or he's trying to stare out the cellist who he already got lined up as a sexual rival. The one who will defeat him, of course. So using music, finding language was all sort of new. I mean, all there for the movie, but not there in the novel. So which made it not boring. It was not simply a matter of transcription.
Could you tell that Ian McEwan had written the screenplay as well? Did it have his stamp on it?
Well, it did. It had his name on the front. No, so I did know. And I was actually really interested to hear that he'd wrestled with his own words. I can't imagine doing, you know what I mean? It's a really, really, really tricky thing to do because he's not a precious man at all. But I can imagine that he's reading his own words and going, well, I don't want to take that out, or I don't want to omit that, or if I omit that, then this has an impact on this and has, So it's a minefield, and that's why he does what he does and I do what I do.
And the different hats that you have to wear, the screenplay writer hat versus the novelist hat, how do you differentiate between the two?
Well, it's a sort of demotion, from God to a kind of little cherub, a puto, or general to, corporal. Movies are still, feature movies, not television movies now, but feature movies still remain by convention a director's form. And part of the pleasure of it is breaking out of the loneliness of sitting hour after hour with your own ghosts, writing a novel, but to be collaborating. And I was very lucky in Dominic Cooke because his roots are in the theatre. So he's used to collaborating closely with a writer. And actually it was the same with Richard Eyre in the Children Act. Again, a man whose long distinguished career has been principally the theatre, although he's made many movies and much else. In terms of exchanging hats, well, you just become part of a process. Writing a novel is to address yourself to a finished literary form. A screenplay is not a finished form. It's like a recipe and it's not the meal. So yeah, it's very, very different.
The first page of the novel alone is just so dense with description. So how did that help with your preparation for Edward?
There is so much detail. Sometimes it helped. You know what? Sometimes it didn't. And it was a hindrance because the blueprint was no longer the novel. I'd read the novel and that was great. It's a really good resource, but that's all it becomes eventually. Your blueprint, your manual is the script, and that's the Bible, that's gospel. And so there was a point at which we kind of all said, look, we've got to leave the novel alone now. Having said that, there were moments where occasionally I would say to Dom, or Dom would say to me, but doesn't Edward do this? Or what in his drawer, doesn't he keep... And I would remember these really kind of almost inane facts about Edward, which for me I find really, really helpful, because I believe the devil's in the detail. And that's really important. But also there is a time pressure with filming, so I would be sometimes maybe too meticulous, and everyone would be going, come on, can we,
And then the prospect of sort of adapting the ending of your own work, because obviously there is a bit of a shift in what happens. What was that? Whose suggestion was that? Yours or?
It was mine, really. I felt that we had to get away from what I had in the novel, which is that Edward's young bride, Florence, simply disappears off the page. She just, we hear that she gave a concert, a few years later. He wasn't sitting in the seat he promised to sit in. The Times critic loved her performance and so on. But no character in the novel knows this. I mean, this is simply in the narration. Cinematically, I think it's compelling that they must have a sort of meeting, even though it's in a crowded auditorium of Wigmore Hall, and very important that they each shed a tear. At one point in the edit, while Edward is blubbing, we didn't have a tear coming out of Saoirse, and I said, we've got to, so we thought we'd have to CGI a tear. Then the editor said, well, I found a cut with a tear. Because, they sort of spray this stuff to make your eyes water.
Didn't know that.
Well, it's very hard to just cry on demand.
I thought Saoirse really was that good.
No. It's just not biologically possible in doing 10 takes to cry every time. You might cry at the end of it for different reasons. And how wonderful. So there is finally this spontaneous, so it seems, tear from an aged up Saoirse. But you can computer generate tears, but they never look quite as good.
The story can be just savagely awkward at times, and so obviously having read the book, were there any scenes that you were dreading filming?
No, I never really dread. I don't dread, because it's not me, it's Edward, first of all. But of course there's sort of crossover and all those sort of awkward things. You want to just honour the writing. That's sacrosanct to me. I want to tell the story, and that's the only reason why I turn up to work, really. Anything else is a bonus. But I was surrounded by people who we all supported and trusted one another. Saoirse and I had a great bond and worked really well together, on and off screen. So what was great was that we were able to have a laugh when we did this really awkward stuff. So it kind of levelled things out.
Speaking of Saoirse, she was really catapulted into the spotlight, obviously, after starring in Atonement. And now she is the perfect Florence. So you two must have a really special relationship.
Well, when I was writing this, Florence, the character is 22. Saoirse was 16. But as I was writing it, I thought this would be just right for Saoirse, if only she were a little older. And because we had such a bumpy ride from first draft to screen, by the time we were in production or nearing it and casting, Saoirse was 22. So it was a real piece of good fortune. I think she's a wonderful reader, or an actor who can really play the inner life on her face. And it was part of the process of rehearsal was to remove unnecessary lines, because she was just playing them out for us. So in a sense, she's a gift to a writer. She can do what cinema finds hard to do, which is to transmit the nature of consciousness, the actual flow of inner life.
What do you think it would look like if it was set today?
Pretty much the same, but you might be wearing no, I'm kidding. You know what? I think there would be similarities. I know that it's informed by the time period, and I've talked about that a lot, and that is very much true. The time period itself, if it's possible, history kind of is a character in this story. The beach is a character in this story. The locations, the hotel room is a character in this story, so it's so multi-layered. So to answer that question, I think I can still imagine someone behaving like Edward today. I'm sure there are people like that who, somewhere in the world, but it's a misunderstanding. So the story itself, of course, it could happen almost exactly the same way. How many times have, you or I had a misunderstanding with our partner, or seen my parents scream at each other, that's just a universal truth. Yeah.
As you said, so much of On Chesil Beach is just filled with internal monologues, and how did you reflect that in the screenplay? Did you have sort of stage directions, or was it just purely dialogue?
I try to avoid too much, but sometimes it's really necessary. The kind of adverbial instructions to actors. I take some instruction in this from Harold Pinter, who I think is a superb screenplay writer, and his screenplays are noticeably empty of any instruction at all, as are his play scripts. I mean, I think it's why directors love playing them. It sets directors free. But I had to give some. I mean, I don't like burdening actors with loads of adverbs about how they should behave. But every now and then, when you're writing a screenplay, you actually are seeing a movie in your head. You know it's not the movie you're going to end up with. It's just not possible. But there are certain key moments when you really want to bring the director's attention to what is the key visual stroke, emotional key to the whole scene. And important to do that in discussion then too. So we need those reference points.
Having starred also in the adaptation of Julian Barnes's The Sense of an Ending, why do you think novels do lend themselves so well to being films?
It's very, very tough, right? I think, I don't know. I'm not. I don't write screenplays, but writing a screenplay from the off, it's a very particular format. I think the amount of detail in both Julian Barnes and, Ian McEwan's work, lends itself to the screen because, those exactly the reason I said before, which is that he writes locations, he writes geography as characters. And that's really fascinating for anyone who's wanting to adapt it, be that the author themselves or not. Because how do you translate that onto the screen visually? How does that come across? And it's a real challenge for the actor and the director and everyone else involved. But this was a truly collaborative process full of really smart people who are very good at their job. So we were very fortunate and blessed.
Off the back of that then, was there one scene in particular that was really gratifying because it was almost exactly on the screen as you'd imagined when you wrote the novel?
The beach scene is the key scene. We knew that in rehearsal, that's why we rehearsed it so much. We knew that we'd be at the mercy of the elements. I mean, we were shooting in October, November, it's meant to be summer. It was not as I imagined it, because I imagined it sunny. It was windy and cold. The rushes are packed with a lady with a blanket rushing out to wrap Saoirse up between takes, hilariously. And of course this blanket's parallel to the ground, the wind was so strong. So Saoirse had to play the whole scene with the wind blowing her hair in her face, and without repeating too many times of brushing it away with her hand. But that scene, the emotional rise and fall of it was more or less as I hoped. Like many rows between people who love each other, there are moments when it's stormy, then there are moments of near reconciliation, and then it all blows up again in another direction. Suddenly they hear a bird singing and she says it's a nightingale, and he ruefully tells her that it's a blackbird. Having to work hard for this prime patch, like me, he says, and for a moment you think they're going to make it, and then erupts again as she makes her bizarre suggestion that they live a sexless life, and he loses his temper. That was really very much how I saw that scene. Almost like a sort of little symphony of boiling up, calming down, slow movements, fast movements.
Ian,
and I'm glad we gave it so many hours of rehearsal.
Thank you so much.
We're here, married.
Nothing went wrong.
Even my mother behaved herself.
You set eyes on me for the first time.
Hello.
Hello?
And I saw a man who wasn't wearing a jacket.
Nonsense.
Oh, yes. And trousers with a mend in the knee.
Did you think then it was love at first sight?
Marry that girl.
What?
Actually, I'm a little bit scared.
What does his father do?
You mean, is he working class or one of us?
That's more or less what I mean.
You don't seem quite as happy as you should. Something's bothering you, Flo.
Come on, Flo, it's easy. Just point and choose.
Something about yourself, a little delicate.
The sex manual says women are like doorways, men can enter through them.
God's sake, Florence. How long have you been there?
I thought I'd just...
Asked you a question, damn it.
Are you all right? I'm feeling rather sick.
What is it, darling?
Nothing.
Flo, you can change your mind.
I really have to go. We can never be happy, and it's all my stupid fault.
Have you actually forgotten that we were married today? We're man and wife! That's what you promised! To me!
It's hopeless.
Is it?